Welcome back to History Teller YT, the place where the past comes alive. Today, we're embarking on an epic journey across oceans, continents, and centuries to explore one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Age of Exploration. From Columbus's daring voyage across the Atlantic to Vasco da Gama's trailblazing route to India, from Magellan's first circumnavigation of the globe to the establishment of sprawling trade networks, this era reshaped the world forever. We'll uncover the remarkable technological innovations that made long-distance navigation possible, the empires that raced to control trade and territory, and the rise of a truly interconnected global economy. But this story is not just about glory and discovery. It's also about the devastating consequences for indigenous peoples, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, and the environmental changes that transformed entire continents. So, get ready to travel through time and across oceans as we reveal the triumphs, tragedies, and enduring legacies of the Age of Exploration. Trust me, once you start this journey, you won't want to stop until you know how exploration changed the entire world forever. Before the Age of Exploration, the world was a patchwork of isolated civilizations. Europe was fragmented, emerging from the shadows of the medieval era, still recovering from the political, economic, and social upheavals of the Black Death. Trade existed, but it was largely regional. The Silk Road connected Europe to Asia, yet the journey was long, perilous, and controlled by intermediaries. Local economies relied on agriculture, and most people had never traveled more than a few dozen miles from their birthplace. Knowledge of the world beyond the Mediterranean was limited, filled with myths and exaggerated tales of distant lands. Maps were rudimentary, often blending geography with legend. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire controlled critical trade routes to the east, making spices and luxury goods extraordinarily expensive for European markets. This scarcity sparked curiosity and ambition. Explorers dreamed of finding faster, safer routes to the riches of Asia, and monarchs saw opportunities to expand wealth and influence through maritime discovery. In this era, exploration was not merely adventure. It was a calculated economic and political necessity. Several forces converged to ignite the Age of Exploration. Economic incentives were paramount. European nations sought gold, silver, spices, silk, and other luxuries that were scarce at home. Religious motives also played a critical role. Following the Reconquista in Spain and the rise of devout monarchies, spreading Christianity became a powerful justification for exploration. Technological innovation fueled these ambitions. Advances in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography made long ocean voyages feasible. The development of the caravel, a small, maneuverable ship capable of handling rough seas, and improvements in instruments like the astrolabe and magnetic compass allowed sailors to venture further with greater confidence. Political competition was another driver. Portugal and Spain, in particular, were locked in a struggle for dominance over trade routes and overseas territories. Exploration became a tool of national pride, a way to claim uncharted lands before rival powers. These combined motivations created an era where daring navigators could embark on journeys that would transform the known world forever. The early pioneers of this era set the stage for global transformation. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator, spearheaded maritime exploration along the West African coast, seeking both gold and a route to Asia. Sailors like Bartholomew Dias pushed around the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Indian Ocean could be accessed from Europe. Meanwhile, Spain looked westward. Christopher Columbus famously proposed reaching Asia by sailing across the Atlantic, securing backing from Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, his fleet of 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, embarked on a journey that would reshape history, inadvertently opening the Americas to European colonization. These early voyages were perilous. Sailors faced storms, disease, scurvy, and the unknown. Yet their courage, combined with emerging navigational tools, set the foundation for an age in which the world would finally begin to shrink. The era of isolation was ending, and a new era of global connectivity was dawning. Christopher Columbus, born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy, was a man whose ambitions exceeded the geographical knowledge of his time. From a young age, he was fascinated with the sea, navigation, and the possibility of undiscovered lands. Columbus believed that by sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach the lucrative markets of Asia, particularly India and China, circumventing the overland routes controlled by rival powers. His vision was bold but controversial. Many scholars of the period believed the Earth's circumference was too vast for such a voyage, fearing that ships and crews would be lost in the open ocean. Columbus was persistent, appealing to multiple European courts for sponsorship. Finally, in 1492, he secured support from Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who saw his journey as a means to expand Spain's influence and spread Christianity. The approval of his expedition marked the beginning of a journey that would transform Europe's perception of the world and change the course of history. It wasn't merely an adventure. It was a carefully calculated endeavor, combining ambition, faith, and the desire for material gain. Columbus's conviction, despite widespread skepticism, exemplifies the spirit of exploration that defined the age of discovery. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The journey across the Atlantic was treacherous and filled with uncertainty. Sailors faced limited provisions, unpredictable weather, and the psychological strain of venturing into the unknown. Columbus relied on dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and his own intuition to guide the fleet. Morale aboard the ships fluctuated. Some sailors feared the myth of a falling-off edge of the world, while others doubted whether land would ever appear. After weeks at sea, tensions grew, yet Columbus remained resolute. On October 12, 1492, land was sighted, an island in the present-day Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. Believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia, Columbus's initial impressions would set the stage for misunderstanding, conquest, and the reshaping of continents. His first voyage not only opened the Western Hemisphere to European exploration, but also inaugurated centuries of cultural exchanges, conflicts, and profound consequences for the indigenous peoples. The Atlantic, once seen as a vast barrier, had been crossed, signaling that Europe could reach new worlds by ship, forever altering global history. Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean marked the beginning of sustained European contact with the Americas. He encountered indigenous peoples, including the Taino, whose societies were organized, resourceful, and entirely unfamiliar with Europeans. Columbus's interactions were initially characterized by curiosity, trade, and attempts to assert authority. He claimed the lands for Spain and sought gold, resources, and potential converts to Christianity. These first encounters, while often described as cordial in early European accounts, quickly set a pattern of exploitation, misunderstanding, and violence that would affect countless generations. The introduction of European diseases devastated indigenous populations, while the imposition of European customs and systems disrupted traditional ways of life. Columbus himself made multiple voyages, establishing settlements and furthering Spain's colonial ambitions, laying the groundwork for a global empire. The legacy of his voyages is complex. On one hand, they exemplify human courage and the drive to explore. On the other, they reveal the costs of contact, conquest, and the often tragic consequences for the peoples of newly discovered lands. This tension between discovery and destruction would define the age of exploration in the centuries that followed. By the late 15th century, Portugal had become a leading European power in maritime exploration, driven by the ambition to control trade routes and access the riches of Asia. Unlike Spain, which sought westward passage, Portugal focused on establishing a route around Africa to reach India and the spice markets of the East. Prince Henry the Navigator had earlier laid the foundations by sponsoring voyages along the West African coast, charting unknown territories and accumulating valuable navigational knowledge. Portuguese explorers sought gold, ivory, and spices, commodities highly prized in Europe. The challenge was monumental. The Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip presented treacherous waters, unpredictable weather, and unknown currents. Many sailors feared the journey, believing the waters to be the edge of the world, and survival was never guaranteed. Yet Portugal's monarchs understood that controlling a maritime route to India would secure a dominant position in global trade. Vasco da Gama, a skilled and determined navigator, was chosen to accomplish what many thought impossible: to sail around Africa and reach India by sea. His mission combined commerce, national ambition, and the desire to establish Portugal as a dominant maritime power in the emerging global economy. In 1497, Vasco da Gama embarked on his historic voyage, commanding a fleet of 4 ships. The expedition faced immediate challenges: navigating uncharted waters, severe storms, and the threat of disease and mutiny among the crew. The voyage required precise knowledge of currents, winds, and celestial navigation, as no detailed maps existed for much of the route. Da Gama sailed down the coast of Africa, stopping at key ports such as Mozambique and Malindi, establishing critical contacts with local rulers and gaining guidance for the next stages of the journey. The fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a perilous point notorious for treacherous seas and sudden storms. Reaching the Indian Ocean marked a monumental achievement. Europe was now connected to Asia by sea. Da Gama's arrival on the Indian coast, specifically Calicut, present-day Kozhikode, was met with a mixture of curiosity and caution by local traders, who had long maintained thriving trade networks across the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese sought spices, silk, and precious gems, commodities that had long been transported overland at great cost. By establishing direct maritime trade, Da Gama dramatically reduced Europe's dependence on intermediary merchants, creating a path for Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean for decades to come. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India had far-reaching consequences, both for Europe and the wider world. For Portugal, it represented a triumph of navigation, diplomacy, and strategic ambition, solidifying its status as a maritime power. The expedition opened a sea-based trade route that allowed Europe direct access to spices and luxury goods, bypassing traditional overland routes controlled by Arab, Ottoman, and Venetian merchants. This development shifted the balance of global commerce and contributed to the rise of Portugal as a wealthy colonial empire. However, the consequences for the Indian Ocean world were profound. Portuguese ships began to exert military and economic influence over established trade networks, disrupting traditional trade patterns and imposing European authority in ways that often led to conflict. The arrival of da Gama and subsequent Portuguese expeditions introduced new weapons, diseases, and political dynamics, altering local societies and economies. While his voyage was celebrated in Europe as a monumental achievement, it also marked the beginning of European intrusion into Asia, presaging centuries of colonial competition, exploitation, and cultural exchange. Vasco da Gama's journey exemplifies the age of exploration's dual nature, a blend of human ingenuity and ambition, accompanied by disruption, conquest, and the reshaping of global history. Ferdinand Magellan, born in Portugal in 1480, was a seasoned sailor and navigator whose ambition went far beyond typical voyages of the time. Unlike explorers seeking trade routes or new lands for conquest, Magellan envisioned sailing westward from Europe to reach the Spice Islands of the East Indies, aiming to establish a Spanish claim over these lucrative territories. At that time, Spain and Portugal were rivals in maritime exploration, divided by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which allocated spheres of influence in the newly discovered world. Magellan's plan was audacious. He sought to sail across uncharted oceans, navigate unknown straits, and cross the Pacific, whose vastness remained a terrifying mystery to European sailors. Many of his contemporaries doubted the feasibility of such a journey. The enormity of the Pacific Ocean was almost incomprehensible. Yet Magellan possessed a combination of navigational skill, strategic foresight, and unwavering determination that convinced King Charles I of Spain to sponsor the expedition. His voyage represented the pinnacle of ambition in the age of exploration, promising not only wealth through access to spices but also prestige, global influence, and the chance to accomplish what no European had ever attempted: to prove the true scope of the Earth's oceans by circumnavigating the globe. In 1519, Magellan departed from Seville with a fleet of 5 ships and approximately 270 men. The expedition immediately faced immense challenges, from treacherous storms in the Atlantic to mutinies among the crew, who questioned his leadership and doubted the feasibility of the mission. As they sailed south along the coast of South America, Magellan had to navigate unknown waterways, ultimately discovering the strait that now bears his name, the Strait of Magellan, which provided a passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This narrow and dangerous channel was filled with unpredictable currents, towering cliffs, and freezing temperatures. Crossing the Pacific Ocean proved even more daunting. The sheer scale of the journey tested the crew's endurance and survival skills. Sailors suffered from scurvy, starvation, and extreme fatigue, with limited knowledge of safe harbors or fresh provisions. Despite these hardships, Magellan's leadership and navigational skill allowed the fleet to maintain course across one of the largest and most uncharted oceans in the world. This unprecedented voyage not only pushed the boundaries of human endurance, but also expanded the European understanding of global geography, revealing the vastness and interconnectedness of the planet's oceans for the first time. Magellan's voyage, completed under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano after Magellan's death in the Philippines, was a historic achievement that transformed global understanding of the world. The successful circumnavigation demonstrated that the Earth was round, and that oceans connected all continents, fundamentally reshaping European conceptions of geography and trade. The expedition also had profound economic and political implications. Spain now possessed a legitimate claim to the Spice Islands, establishing a foothold for future colonization and trade, while European nations began competing more aggressively for global influence. However, the journey also highlighted the human cost of exploration. Of the original 270 crew members, only 18 survived the entire circumnavigation. Encounters with indigenous peoples were often violent, marked by conflicts and misunderstandings, reflecting a broader pattern of conquest and exploitation that would define European expansion in the centuries to follow. Magellan's voyage embodies the paradox of the age of exploration. It was an era of extraordinary courage, knowledge, and human achievement, yet it also ushered in a period of conquest, cultural disruption, and profound consequences for populations around the world. His circumnavigation remains one of the most iconic and transformative voyages in human history. The voyages of Columbus and other early explorers initiated a profound and unprecedented exchange between the Old World and the New World, later known as the Columbian Exchange. This term encompasses the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, and ideas across the Atlantic, reshaping societies on both sides of the ocean. Europeans introduced horses, cattle, pigs, and wheat to the Americas, dramatically transforming agriculture, transportation, and daily life for indigenous peoples. Conversely, the Americas contributed crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco to Europe, fueling population growth, altering diets, and even influencing economies and cuisines across the continent. The exchange was not limited to flora and fauna. It also involved the movement of people, ideas, and technologies. Navigation techniques, tools, and cultural practices spread alongside biological exchanges, creating a web of interconnectedness unprecedented in human history. However, this exchange also carried devastating consequences. European diseases, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, decimated indigenous populations who lacked immunity, leading to mortality rates as high as 90% in some communities. The Columbian Exchange thus represents both the transformative power of contact and the tragic costs of early globalization, laying the foundation for the complex interplay of ecological, cultural, and economic forces that would define the modern world. Following Columbus's voyages, Spain rapidly established settlements and colonies throughout the Caribbean and, later, in Central and South America. The Spanish crown sought to extract wealth, spread Christianity, and assert political control over newly discovered territories. Conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro became infamous for their military campaigns against powerful indigenous empires like the Aztecs and Incas. These campaigns combined superior European weaponry, strategic alliances with rival indigenous groups, and the devastating effects of disease, resulting in the collapse of complex civilizations and the seizure of vast wealth in gold, silver, and other resources. Colonization also involved imposing European governance, religion, and culture on indigenous populations, often through coercion and forced labor systems such as the encomienda, which obligated native people to work for Spanish settlers under brutal conditions. Spanish settlements quickly transformed the Caribbean into the first European foothold in the Americas, serving as staging points for further exploration, conquest, and trade. The social and cultural impact of this colonization was profound. Indigenous communities were displaced, enslaved, or decimated, while European languages, religion, and customs began reshaping the Americas. These early colonies set a precedent for European imperialism, illustrating how exploration and conquest were inextricably linked with exploitation and cultural transformation. The consequences of early colonization and the Columbian Exchange extended far beyond the Americas. Economically, the influx of silver and other resources from the New World into Europe fueled commercial growth, strengthened national monarchies, and facilitated the rise of global trade networks. Agricultural products from the Americas, like potatoes and maize, contributed to population booms in Europe, reshaping labor markets, urban development, and social structures. Culturally, contact with the Americas sparked new ideas, curiosity, and debates about human societies, governance, and morality, influencing European thought and literature. At the same time, the devastating decline of indigenous populations created labor shortages, prompting the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas, intertwining European expansion with new forms of oppression and exploitation. The Columbian Exchange and colonization thus inaugurated a truly global system of economic, social, and ecological transformation. These early encounters between continents illustrate both the ingenuity and ambition of the age of exploration and its darker dimensions: conquest, disease, and the profound reshaping of societies. By linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas, this period laid the groundwork for modern globalization, demonstrating that the world was now interconnected in ways that would echo for centuries. In 1519, Hernán Cortés embarked on a voyage that would forever alter the history of the Americas. Landing on the coast of present-day Mexico, Cortés initially engaged in diplomacy and alliances with indigenous groups who were discontent with Aztec rule. The Aztec Empire, ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II, was one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, boasting impressive urban centers, complex social hierarchies, and extensive trade networks. Cortés recognized that direct confrontation with the Aztec military would be difficult, so he leveraged alliances with rival indigenous states, exploiting local grievances to strengthen his forces. Using superior European weaponry, including firearms, cannons, and steel swords, alongside cavalry unfamiliar to the Aztec warriors, Cortés gained an advantage despite being vastly outnumbered. The siege of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, involved strategic planning, psychological warfare, and manipulation of local politics. After months of brutal conflict, smallpox epidemics ravaged the population, weakening the city's defenses. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell, marking the collapse of the Aztec Empire. Cortés' conquest exemplifies the combination of military strategy, technological advantage, and disease as decisive factors in the Spanish conquests, highlighting both the ingenuity of the explorers and the devastating consequences for indigenous civilizations. While Cortés conquered the Aztecs, Francisco Pizarro led a similarly transformative expedition to South America. In the 1530s, Pizarro targeted the Inca Empire, a sprawling and wealthy civilization along the Andes with a sophisticated system of administration, roads, and agriculture. Pizarro's approach mirrored Cortés' strategy. He exploited internal divisions, particularly a civil war between Inca rulers Atahualpa and Huáscar, to secure alliances with discontented factions. The Spanish forces, though small in number, utilized superior weapons, cavalry, and the element of surprise to subdue larger indigenous armies. The capture and eventual execution of Atahualpa symbolized the collapse of Inca political authority and paved the way for Spanish domination. The conquest led to the extraction of immense quantities of gold and silver, which would enrich Spain and fuel global trade, but it also precipitated the destruction of Inca cultural, political, and social structures. Entire communities were uprooted, and forced labor systems like the encomienda and mita were imposed to exploit native populations for mining and agriculture. Pizarro's conquest illustrates the brutal efficiency of European colonizers and the catastrophic consequences for indigenous empires, highlighting the destructive intersection of military technology, disease, and opportunistic diplomacy that characterized much of the Age of Exploration. The Spanish conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires had ramifications far beyond the immediate destruction of civilizations. Economically, the massive influx of gold and silver from the Americas transformed Europe's financial systems, fueling the rise of capitalism, inflation, and the expansion of international trade networks. Culturally, these conquests facilitated the spread of Christianity, Spanish language, and European social structures throughout the Americas, creating a lasting legacy of colonization that continues to influence Latin America today. The demographic impact on indigenous populations was catastrophic. Disease, warfare, and forced labor led to the near annihilation of millions, fundamentally altering the social fabric of the continent. At the same time, these conquests accelerated the development of global interconnections. European powers recognized the potential of overseas empires, and competition intensified for territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The conquests also prompted moral and philosophical debates in Europe, as thinkers like Bartolomé de las Casas condemned the mistreatment of native peoples, questioning the ethics of empire. Ultimately, the fall of the Aztec and Inca empires exemplifies the dual nature of the Age of Exploration, an era of extraordinary human achievement, navigational skill, and ambition, but one also marked by violence, exploitation, and profound cultural disruption on a global scale. During the 15th and early 16th centuries, Portugal emerged as the dominant European maritime power, with ambitions extending far beyond European waters. African coasts became critical points for trade, exploration, and the establishment of strategic forts. Portuguese explorers, motivated by the pursuit of gold, ivory, and slaves, sailed along the West African coast, mapping harbors, rivers, and navigational routes previously unknown to Europeans. Cities like Elmina and São Tomé became pivotal centers for commerce, enabling the Portuguese to engage directly with local kingdoms and secure valuable commodities. Trade agreements were often negotiated with local rulers, blending diplomacy, coercion, and military superiority. Portugal's presence reshaped regional economies. Local societies began to integrate European goods and currencies, while simultaneously facing new forms of dependency and conflict. The trade in enslaved Africans began during this period, laying the foundation for what would become the transatlantic slave trade. Portuguese forts and trading posts acted as hubs for economic and military power, establishing a pattern of overseas control that influenced later European colonization strategies. Africa's role in the Age of Exploration illustrates the interconnection between maritime innovation, economic ambition, and human exploitation, as Portugal leveraged both naval technology and local political dynamics to extend its influence far from its European homeland. Portugal's ambitions extended beyond Africa into the Indian Ocean, a region dominated by sophisticated trade networks connecting India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to Calicut had already demonstrated the feasibility of direct sea trade with India, bypassing intermediaries and revolutionizing global commerce. Portuguese ships, equipped with advanced navigational tools and heavily armed, established strategic coastal fortresses and trading posts in Goa, Malacca, and other key locations. These outposts allowed the Portuguese to control spice trade routes, regulate shipping, and project military power across vast distances. Their presence disrupted long-standing trading systems that had connected Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants for centuries, introducing European dominance into a previously interconnected and relatively balanced economic system. The Portuguese also brought European culture, religion, and military strategies into the region, often imposing their authority through coercion, alliances, and naval superiority. The Indian Ocean expansion highlights the strategic use of maritime technology, diplomacy, and force in establishing an overseas empire, demonstrating how exploration was closely tied to economic control, territorial ambition, and the projection of national power on a global scale. Portugal's expansion in Africa and Asia had profound and lasting impacts on global history. Economically, it facilitated direct access to highly prized commodities, including spices, gold, and ivory, contributing to Portugal's rise as a wealthy maritime power. The Portuguese model of overseas forts, naval dominance, and controlled trade routes became a template for subsequent European empires, including the Dutch, British, and French. Culturally, Portuguese influence introduced European languages, religion, and customs into new regions, leaving enduring legacies in places like Goa, Macau, and Brazil. However, this expansion also brought profound disruptions. Indigenous societies were often subjected to forced labor, taxation, and military intimidation, while established trade networks were reorganized to favor European interests. In Africa, the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade initiated centuries of human suffering and displacement. The Portuguese also encountered resistance, negotiations, and adaptation from local populations, highlighting the complex interactions between European powers and indigenous societies. Ultimately, Portugal's African and Asian ventures exemplify the Age of Exploration's dual nature, an era of impressive navigational achievements, economic innovation, and cultural exchange, but also of exploitation, coercion, and enduring human consequences. The Portuguese legacy demonstrates how maritime exploration reshaped continents and established the foundations of global interconnectedness. After the conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires, Spain rapidly moved to consolidate its control over the vast territories of the Americas. Spanish colonization was driven by a combination of economic ambition, religious motives, and political strategy. The crown sought to secure wealth, primarily in the form of gold and silver, while also expanding Spanish influence and spreading Christianity. Early colonies were often established in strategic locations, such as Havana, Santo Domingo, and Veracruz, which acted as administrative, military, and trade hubs. Settlers included a mix of soldiers, administrators, missionaries, and laborers who were responsible for implementing European systems of governance and culture. Indigenous populations were integrated into colonial structures through coerced labor systems, most notably the encomienda, which required native people to provide labor in exchange for nominal protection and religious instruction. These early settlements were not merely small towns. They were instruments of empire, designed to project Spanish authority, exploit natural resources, and serve as bases for further expansion. The establishment of colonial institutions, including churches, local councils, and military garrisons, reflected Spain's systematic approach to controlling newly acquired territories and creating an enduring presence in the Americas. Spanish colonies introduced profound social, cultural, and religious transformations in the Americas. The Spanish crown implemented rigid hierarchical systems that categorized people by ethnicity and birth, giving Europeans the highest status, mixed-race individuals an intermediate status, and indigenous peoples the lowest. Catholic missionaries, particularly members of orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, played a critical role in spreading Christianity, often using conversion, education, and church building as tools of cultural influence. Indigenous beliefs, languages, and practices were suppressed or syncretized with European traditions, resulting in complex cultural blending that continues to shape Latin American societies today. Spanish architecture, language, laws, and education became dominant, and cities were designed to reflect European ideals, with central plazas, churches, and government buildings symbolizing authority. This cultural transformation was not passive. Indigenous communities resisted, adapted, and negotiated, creating hybrid societies that combined European and native elements. The early Spanish colonies thus became laboratories for experimentation in governance, religion, and social control, demonstrating the extent to which exploration and colonization could reshape entire continents at the level of daily life, belief systems, and societal structures. Economically, the Spanish colonies were engines of wealth for the crown and a cornerstone of emerging global trade networks. The discovery of rich silver mines in places like Potosi and Zacatecas fueled Spain's economy and allowed it to exert influence across Europe and beyond. Indigenous labor was exploited extensively in mining, agriculture, and construction, often under harsh and deadly conditions. Colonists introduced European crops and livestock, transforming local ecologies and agricultural practices, while the colonies became centers for producing goods for export to Europe. Trade regulations, such as the Casa de Contratación in Seville, centralized control of commerce and ensured that wealth flowed primarily to the Spanish monarchy. These economic activities connected the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia through complex networks that included the exchange of goods, labor, and ideas. The Spanish colonies exemplified the intertwined nature of exploration, conquest, and economic exploitation, showing how the age of exploration was not merely a series of voyages, but a coordinated system of empire building. By controlling trade, labor, and production in the Americas, Spain established a foundation for centuries of global influence, shaping the course of world history through both wealth and power. One of the most profound and tragic consequences of European exploration and colonization was the introduction of diseases to indigenous populations in the Americas. Europeans carried with them smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other infectious diseases, which spread rapidly among populations that had no prior exposure or immunity. Unlike Europe, where recurring outbreaks allowed populations to develop some level of resistance, the native peoples of the Americas were biologically unprepared for these pathogens. The effects were catastrophic. In some regions, mortality rates reached as high as 90%, decimating entire communities and disrupting social, political, and economic structures. Major civilizations, including the Aztec and Inca empires, were weakened even before the full force of European conquest, as disease spread ahead of the arrival of explorers. Smallpox epidemics caused mass death, leaving villages abandoned, food production disrupted, and social hierarchies destabilized. The psychological impact was equally devastating, as communities struggled to comprehend the sudden loss of life and the breakdown of familiar structures. European colonizers, often unaware of their role in spreading disease, exploited these weakened societies, advancing their control through both military force and opportunistic diplomacy. Disease thus became an unintended but highly effective tool in the colonization process, underscoring the profound biological dimension of the age of exploration. Despite the overwhelming devastation caused by European diseases and military technology, indigenous peoples did not remain passive in the face of colonization. Resistance took many forms, ranging from organized military opposition to subtle acts of cultural survival. In Mesoamerica, for instance, remnants of Aztec nobility attempted to reclaim territory and assert political authority, forming alliances and engaging in guerrilla tactics against Spanish forces. In the Andes, indigenous communities resisted labor exploitation through revolts, flight to remote areas, and negotiation with colonial authorities. Resistance was not only military but also cultural. Indigenous populations preserved languages, religious practices, and social traditions even under harsh colonial pressures, blending native and European elements to create resilient hybrid cultures. Adaptation often involved strategic cooperation with European powers to secure survival, while simultaneously maintaining elements of autonomy and identity. These acts of resistance and adaptation highlight the agency of indigenous peoples, challenging the narrative of passive victimhood. They demonstrate that colonization was not a simple story of European domination, but a complex interaction of coercion, survival, negotiation, and resilience, shaping the long-term dynamics of cultural and social transformation in the Americas. The combination of disease, conquest, and colonial exploitation resulted in long-term demographic and social transformations across the Americas. Population decline forced Spanish and other European colonizers to restructure labor systems, leading to the introduction of African slavery to supplement the diminished indigenous workforce. Entire social hierarchies were reshaped, as surviving indigenous populations were often subjugated under European legal and economic systems. Urban and rural settlements were reorganized to reflect European models, with churches, forts, and administrative centers asserting colonial control. The catastrophic population loss also transformed cultural practices, family structures, and community organization, creating lasting social scars that shaped indigenous societies for centuries. Beyond the Americas, these demographic changes had global repercussions, as the movement of labor, goods, and peoples increasingly connected continents. European wealth, drawn in part from the exploitation of devastated populations, fueled global trade networks and military expansion. The age of exploration, therefore, was marked not only by discovery and maritime achievement, but also by unprecedented human suffering and transformation. The interplay of disease, resistance, and adaptation illustrates the complex consequences of exploration, revealing a world irrevocably changed by contact, conquest, and survival. The transatlantic slave trade emerged as one of the darkest and most consequential aspects of the age of exploration, driven by the economic ambitions of European powers. As European colonies in the Americas expanded, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil, labor demands increased exponentially. Indigenous populations had already been decimated by disease and warfare, creating a critical labor shortage for plantation economies focused on sugar, tobacco, and later cotton. Europeans turned to Africa as a source of enslaved labor, establishing networks to capture, transport, and sell millions of people. Portuguese merchants were pioneers in this system, initially trading along the West African coast for gold and other resources, before increasingly engaging in the sale of enslaved Africans. Over the next centuries, the trade expanded, involving Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, creating a vast, brutal system that connected Africa, the Americas, and Europe in a triangular trade network. Enslaved Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, often through warfare, raids, or betrayal, and subjected to inhumane conditions during transport across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage. Mortality rates were shockingly high, and those who survived faced lifelong exploitation in foreign lands. This system of human trafficking exemplifies the intersection of economic ambition, imperial power, and moral compromise that defined much of the Age of Exploration, illustrating how European expansion relied on profound human suffering for material gain. The transatlantic slave trade functioned as a highly organized system involving multiple stages. European traders established fortified ports and trading posts along the African coast, such as Elmina and Goree Island, to control the capture and sale of enslaved people. African intermediaries, including kings and merchants, often participated, capturing rival groups or individuals to trade with Europeans for guns, textiles, and other goods. Enslaved Africans were then transported in horrific conditions across the Atlantic Ocean. Ships were overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly ventilated, leading to widespread disease, malnutrition, and death. Survivors were sold at auctions in ports across the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern colonies of North America. Enslaved people were forced to work on plantations, in mines, and in households, enduring brutal labor, punishment, and the denial of basic human rights. The economic output generated from this labor fueled European economies, facilitated the accumulation of capital, and enabled further exploration, colonization, and technological advancement. The slave trade was thus deeply intertwined with the broader processes of the Age of Exploration, highlighting how European wealth and expansion were often built upon exploitation, coercion, and the systematic oppression of millions of people across continents. The transatlantic slave trade had profound and enduring consequences for Africa, the Americas, and Europe. In Africa, the removal of millions of individuals disrupted societies, depopulated regions, and intensified local conflicts, fundamentally altering political and economic structures. In the Americas, enslaved Africans were central to the economic development of European colonies, shaping agricultural practices, labor systems, and social hierarchies. The forced migration created lasting cultural and demographic impacts, contributing to the rich cultural diversity of the Americas while simultaneously embedding legacies of racism, inequality, and social stratification. Europe benefited economically, with profits from plantations and trade financing industrial development and further imperial expansion. The moral and human cost of the slave trade, however, was immense, leaving scars that persist to this day. It also sparked resistance, rebellion, and cultural resilience among enslaved communities, who preserved languages, religions, and traditions despite brutal oppression. The transatlantic slave trade demonstrates the darker side of the Age of Exploration, an era of extraordinary navigation, commerce, and connectivity, but one in which human lives were commodified, suffering was systemic, and the pursuit of wealth and power came at the expense of basic humanity. Understanding this history is essential to grasping the global dynamics that shaped the modern world. The age of exploration was not only defined by daring voyages and ambitious empires, but also by remarkable technological innovations that made long-distance sea travel feasible. Central to this was the development of new ship designs, particularly the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable vessel capable of sailing against the wind. The caravel combined speed, durability, and cargo capacity, allowing explorers to venture into unknown waters and endure long journeys across open oceans. These ships featured lateen sails, which provided superior navigational flexibility, and shallow drafts, enabling them to approach coasts and navigate rivers. Additionally, larger vessels such as carracks and galleons were developed for transoceanic travel, capable of carrying significant amounts of cargo, provisions, and armaments. Shipbuilding also benefited from improved understanding of hydrodynamics, timber selection, and hull construction techniques, which enhanced seaworthiness and longevity. Beyond the ships themselves, maritime infrastructure evolved, including docks, ports, and shipyards that supported long-term exploration and trade. These innovations reflected the convergence of scientific knowledge, practical experience, and economic incentive. Without such advances in shipbuilding, the ambitious voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan would have been far more perilous or impossible, highlighting the essential role of technology in the expansion of European influence across the globe. Alongside ship design, advances in navigation were crucial to the success of European explorers. Mariners relied on tools such as the astrolabe, quadrant, and compass to determine latitude, estimate direction, and maintain course over vast, open seas. Celestial navigation became a critical skill, with sailors using the sun, moon, and stars to chart their positions when out of sight of land. Cartography or map-making also advanced significantly during this period. Portuguese and Spanish cartographers compiled knowledge from previous voyages, indigenous informants, and travelers' accounts to create increasingly accurate charts of coastlines, ocean currents, and trade routes. The development of portolan charts provided detailed representations of harbors and navigational hazards, greatly reducing the risks of coastal travel. The production of the first printed maps facilitated the dissemination of geographic knowledge across Europe, allowing future explorers to plan voyages with greater precision. These navigational innovations were not merely technical. They reflected the broader scientific curiosity and empirical approach emerging in Europe. By combining observational data, mathematical calculations, and practical experience, explorers were able to traverse oceans previously deemed impassable. The improvements in navigation transformed the world from a collection of isolated regions into a connected global network, setting the stage for the vast commercial, cultural, and political exchanges that defined the age of exploration. Technological innovation during the age of exploration extended beyond ships and navigation to include advancements in weaponry and military strategy. European explorers and colonizers carried firearms, cannons, crossbows, and steel swords, providing a decisive advantage over indigenous forces who relied primarily on traditional weapons such as bows, spears, and clubs. Naval warfare strategies evolved to protect valuable cargo, enforce trade monopolies, and control newly claimed territories. Cannons were mounted on ships to defend against pirates, rival powers, and resistant indigenous populations, while boarding tactics and artillery formations became standard practice in maritime campaigns. Coastal fortresses were constructed in Africa, Asia, and the Americas to secure ports, trade routes, and settlements, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of military engineering. The integration of these military technologies with advanced ships and navigation enabled European powers to assert control over vast regions, often with relatively small forces, by leveraging strategic advantages in firepower and maneuverability. These innovations reveal the interdependent nature of exploration and conquest. Technological superiority allowed explorers to survive long voyages, engage effectively in combat, and establish enduring colonies. In essence, the Age of Exploration was as much a technological revolution as it was a geographic one, demonstrating how human ingenuity and innovation reshaped the possibilities of global interaction and imperial ambition. During the Age of Exploration, Spain and Portugal emerged as the first European powers to establish extensive global trade networks, leveraging maritime technology, navigation, and colonial possessions to dominate commerce on an unprecedented scale. Portugal's strategic control of the African coast, the Indian Ocean, and ports in Asia allowed it to monopolize the spice trade, particularly in commodities like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Portuguese trading posts in Goa, Malacca, and Macau facilitated direct European access to these lucrative markets, bypassing the overland routes that had long been controlled by Arab and Venetian merchants. Spain, on the other hand, concentrated on the Americas, extracting silver, gold, and agricultural goods from colonies in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. Spanish galleons transported these riches across the Atlantic, establishing trade routes that connected Europe, the Americas, and Asia. The Manila galleons, for example, transported silver from the Americas to the Philippines, exchanging it for silk, porcelain, and spices from China. These early trade networks exemplify how exploration, conquest, and economic ambition were intertwined, enabling Iberian nations to accumulate wealth, project influence, and reshape global commerce. Their dominance established the foundations of a truly interconnected world economy, linking continents, cultures, and markets in ways never before possible. Iberian control of trade routes was maintained through a combination of monopoly, military power, and diplomatic agreements. Portugal, through strategic alliances and fortified ports, sought to dominate key maritime choke points such as the Strait of Malacca and the Cape of Good Hope, ensuring that European competitors could not easily access the Indian Ocean spice trade. Spain relied on colonial administration, naval convoys, and strict trade regulations, including the Casa de Contratación, to control the flow of wealth from the Americas. These monopolistic practices not only enriched the Iberian crowns but also shaped global economic patterns, influencing the distribution of commodities, labor, and capital. European rivals, including the Dutch, English, and French, increasingly challenged these monopolies, leading to conflicts and the eventual erosion of Iberian dominance by the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Nevertheless, the Iberians' early achievements set the stage for subsequent competition, demonstrating the economic potential of global trade, the importance of maritime supremacy, and the complex interdependence of European, African, Asian, and American economies. The early control of trade by Spain and Portugal reveals how exploration was inseparable from economic strategy, geopolitical ambition, and the creation of a global network that would shape centuries of commerce and imperial rivalry. The global trade networks established by Spain and Portugal had profound cultural, political, and social impacts that extended far beyond mere commerce. Economically, the wealth generated fueled European population growth, urbanization, and the rise of early capitalist institutions, influencing banking, finance, and markets across the continent. Culturally, trade facilitated the exchange of ideas, religions, technologies, and artistic practices, creating early forms of globalization. For example, European, African, and Asian goods, culinary traditions, and artistic styles began to mix, producing hybrid cultural forms in port cities, colonies, and trading hubs. Politically, Iberian control of global trade routes enhanced the power of monarchies, enabling them to project influence, wage wars, and negotiate with other European states from positions of strength. Conversely, indigenous and local populations often faced exploitation, labor coercion, and the disruption of traditional economies, demonstrating the human costs of these trade networks. The integration of continents through commerce, labor, and resource extraction transformed the world into an interconnected system, illustrating the profound and enduring legacy of Spain and Portugal's pioneering role in global trade. The age of exploration, therefore, was not just about discovery or conquest. It was about establishing the first truly global networks of wealth, influence, and cultural exchange. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Spain and Portugal's dominance of global trade faced increasing challenges from northern European powers. The Dutch, English, and French, motivated by the wealth generated from the Iberian empires, began to invest heavily in maritime exploration, privateering, and trade companies. Unlike the earlier Iberian model, these emerging powers focused not only on conquest but also on commercial efficiency, joint stock companies, and naval warfare. The Dutch, through the Dutch East India Company (VOC), established a sophisticated network of trading posts and fortresses in Asia, particularly in Indonesia, securing a monopoly on valuable spices such as nutmeg, cloves, and mace. Similarly, the English and French established colonies in North America and trading posts in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, competing for access to raw materials and markets. This era marked a shift from territorial conquest as the primary goal to strategic economic competition, with military, diplomatic, and financial tools used to dominate trade. Northern European nations challenged Iberian monopolies not only through superior organization and financing but also through technological innovation in shipbuilding and naval artillery. This competition reshaped global commerce, paving the way for centuries of rivalry, colonization, and maritime supremacy that would define the modern world economy. Naval conflict and privateering played a critical role in the challenges posed to Iberian dominance. English and Dutch privateers, often state-sanctioned, attacked Spanish treasure fleets, seizing valuable silver, gold, and trade goods. Figures such as Sir Francis Drake became legendary for their daring raids, which not only enriched their sponsors but also undermined Spain's economic control and morale. Naval warfare evolved into a critical instrument of commerce and empire, with the ability to control sea lanes determining access to trade routes, resources, and colonies. The Dutch, in particular, developed highly efficient, armed merchant vessels capable of both trade and defense, while also establishing fortified trading posts to protect economic interests. The English and French employed similar strategies in the Caribbean, India, and Africa, creating a competitive global network that directly challenged the Iberian stranglehold. This new model emphasized not only the economic benefits of trade, but also the importance of strategic maritime power, technological innovation, and flexible alliances with local rulers. By combining commercial ambition with military prowess, these northern European powers accelerated the shift toward a multipolar global economy, weakening the once unchallenged Iberian dominance and laying the groundwork for centuries of European imperial rivalry. The rise of Dutch, English, and French maritime powers had far-reaching economic, cultural, and global consequences. Economically, it introduced competition into the global trade system, reducing the monopolistic control of Spain and Portugal and leading to lower prices, increased accessibility of goods, and the rise of capitalist economies in Northern Europe. The establishment of colonies and trade networks facilitated the movement of commodities, people, and capital across continents, creating complex interdependencies that shaped early modern globalization. Culturally, these rival powers brought their languages, religions, and social structures to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, creating diverse colonial societies with hybrid identities. The challenge to Iberian trade dominance also prompted technological advancements in navigation, shipbuilding, and military engineering, accelerating Europe's capacity to project power worldwide. Furthermore, these competitive pressures encouraged more efficient management of colonies and commercial enterprises, including innovations such as joint stock companies, banking systems, and insurance mechanisms that would influence global trade for centuries. This period of northern European expansion illustrates the dynamic nature of the age of exploration. Discovery, conquest, and trade were deeply intertwined with economic strategy, military power, and cultural exchange, reshaping the global order and setting the stage for the modern era of imperialism and globalization. Life in the early Spanish, Portuguese, and other European colonies of the Americas was shaped by the interplay of geography, economy, and culture. Settlers arrived from Europe with varying motivations. Some sought wealth, others sought religious freedom, while many were motivated by adventure or the promise of land. Early settlements often faced harsh environmental conditions, including unfamiliar climates, tropical diseases, and limited access to food and clean water. Communities had to develop strategies for survival, including agriculture, animal husbandry, and trade with indigenous peoples. Settlers constructed homes, churches, and administrative buildings that mirrored European architectural styles, creating urban centers that served as hubs of colonial life. Life in rural areas, on the other hand, revolved around labor-intensive farming or mining operations. Families and communities were tightly knit, often relying on mutual aid, social networks, and religious institutions for cohesion and support. Daily life included a mix of work, religious observance, and cultural practices imported from Europe, sometimes blended with indigenous traditions. Despite the challenges, these settlements formed the foundation of European control in the New World, demonstrating the adaptability, resilience, and resourcefulness of colonists in unfamiliar and often hostile environments. Colonial societies in the New World were highly stratified and organized around rigid social hierarchies that placed Europeans at the top, indigenous populations and enslaved Africans at the bottom, and mixed-race individuals in intermediate positions. This hierarchical system was reinforced by laws, economic structures, and cultural norms, with European-born elites wielding political, economic, and religious authority. The Catholic Church played a central role in shaping social life, education, and cultural practices, while also acting as a tool for colonization, conversion, and social control. Despite the imposed hierarchies, the New World became a site of cultural blending. Indigenous knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and geography contributed to colonial survival and development. African cultural traditions, brought forcibly through the transatlantic slave trade, influenced music, cuisine, religion, and labor practices. Over time, these interactions produced hybrid cultures, languages, and social norms that were distinct from Europe, reflecting the complex human dynamics of colonization. Festivals, religious ceremonies, culinary practices, and artistic expressions became arenas for cultural negotiation, adaptation, and resistance. Colonial society was thus both a reflection of European structures and a dynamic, evolving system shaped by the interactions of diverse peoples across the Americas. Economically, colonial life in the New World was dominated by resource extraction, agriculture, and labor exploitation. Spanish colonies relied heavily on mining operations in regions such as Potosí, Zacatecas, and Mexico, extracting silver and gold to fuel the European economy. Agricultural production, including sugar, tobacco, and later cotton, was central to Portuguese and English colonies, creating plantation economies that demanded intensive labor. Indigenous populations were initially coerced into labor systems like the encomienda and mida, which imposed work obligations in exchange for nominal protection and religious instruction. As indigenous populations declined due to disease and exploitation, enslaved Africans were increasingly imported to sustain labor-intensive industries. This combination of forced labor and European capital created highly productive, export-oriented colonial economies. Trade networks connected plantations and mines to ports, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and capital across continents. The economic structures of colonial life not only enriched European powers but also entrenched social hierarchies and systems of inequality that would have long-term consequences. By integrating labor, production, and trade into a global system, colonial economies exemplified the interconnection between local life in the New World and the broader processes of European expansion, commerce, and imperial ambition. The exploration of North America began with the ambition of several European powers to expand their influence, discover resources, and claim territories in the New World. Spanish explorers, such as Juan Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto, ventured into Florida and the southeastern regions in search of gold and other wealth, mapping coasts and rivers while establishing fleeting settlements. These expeditions were often arduous, marked by harsh climates, unfamiliar landscapes, and resistance from indigenous communities. The French focused on exploration of the northern regions, particularly the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, seeking fur, timber, and strategic trade partnerships with local indigenous nations. Samuel de Champlain, known as the Father of New France, founded Quebec in 1608, emphasizing both exploration and the establishment of long-term settlements. Meanwhile, the English, driven by mercantile ambition and later religious motivations, established colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, including Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. These early expeditions required significant maritime skill, fortitude, and strategic alliances with indigenous groups, and they often determined the future trajectory of settlement, trade, and conflict. The early European presence in North America laid the foundation for centuries of colonization, establishing cultural, political, and economic patterns that would shape the continent profoundly. European expansion in North America profoundly affected the indigenous populations through a combination of trade, alliance, displacement, and conflict. Indigenous groups initially engaged with European settlers to access goods such as metal tools, firearms, textiles, and alcohol, forming complex trade networks that influenced local economies and politics. However, the arrival of Europeans also brought disease, such as smallpox and influenza, devastating communities and destabilizing political structures. European ambitions for land and resources frequently led to violent confrontations, with wars and skirmishes erupting over territory, trade, and sovereignty. Despite this, indigenous groups demonstrated resilience, forming strategic alliances with different European powers to counter rivals and preserve autonomy. Tribes adapted culturally, militarily, and economically to the presence of Europeans, incorporating new technologies while maintaining traditional practices. These interactions shaped early North American society, demonstrating the complex dynamics of resistance, accommodation, and negotiation. European colonization did not occur in a vacuum, but in direct engagement with thriving, sophisticated indigenous societies, whose responses to exploration and conquest influenced the patterns of settlement, governance, and culture that would endure for centuries. The establishment of European colonies in North America relied on the creation of economic systems that supported settlement and trade. The Spanish colonies in the Southwest focused on missions, agriculture, and mining, often using forced labor from indigenous populations. The French colonies, particularly in Canada and Louisiana, were largely oriented toward fur trade, relying on partnerships with Native American tribes to access and transport pelts. English colonies developed plantation economies in the southern regions, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo, which required significant labor input and later relied heavily on enslaved Africans. Northern English colonies emphasized smaller-scale farming, commerce, and urban development, reflecting a more diversified economy. Trade networks connected colonies internally and externally, linking agricultural production, fur, and other goods to European markets. The combination of labor systems, resource extraction, and commercial enterprise allowed these colonies to sustain themselves and grow, attracting more settlers and solidifying European claims. These economic foundations also shaped social hierarchies, governance structures, and cultural practices, demonstrating that European exploration was inseparable from the creation of enduring institutions and systems of control in the New World. North America became a site where exploration, colonization, and commerce intersected to produce transformative, long-lasting effects on global history. During the Age of Exploration, Europe's maritime powers turned their attention to Asia, a region rich in spices, textiles, and precious metals that had long driven global trade. Portugal, as the pioneering European force, established a network of fortified trading posts along key maritime routes. Goa, on the western coast of India, became the administrative and commercial hub of Portuguese operations, controlling spice trade and projecting naval power across the Indian Ocean. In Southeast Asia, Malacca served as a crucial choke point, enabling the Portuguese to regulate trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Macau on the southern coast of China acted as a center for commerce, facilitating exchanges between Europe and East Asia. Spanish expansion into Asia focused primarily on the Philippines, which served as a strategic hub connecting the Americas to East Asia via the Manila galleons. These galleons transported silver from the Americas to China, exchanging it for silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods. European powers relied on alliances with local rulers, as well as military fortifications and naval dominance, to maintain control over trade and territory. This expansion transformed Asia's coastal regions into nodes of global commerce, introducing European influence while interacting with well-established Asian economies that had existed for centuries. European engagement in Asia was not limited to conquest but included sophisticated commercial and cultural interactions. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later English and French traders integrated into pre-existing Asian trade networks, which included India, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The trade involved not only spices but also textiles, ceramics, metals, and luxury goods, creating a vibrant and complex system of exchange. European traders learned local languages, adopted regional business practices, and engaged in diplomatic negotiations with Asian rulers to secure commercial privileges. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, traveled alongside traders to spread Christianity, often learning local cultures and sciences to better integrate into society. The cultural exchange was bidirectional. Europeans adopted Asian goods, culinary traditions, and technologies, while Asians were introduced to European navigation, weapons, and ideas. Ports like Batavia, modern Jakarta, and Nagasaki became centers of intercultural interaction, blending European, Asian, and later colonial influences. These exchanges reshaped both continents, highlighting the intricate interdependence of commerce, culture, and diplomacy in the Age of Exploration. European activity in Asia demonstrates that the era was as much about negotiation, adaptation, and cultural integration as it was about conquest and economic domination. Trade with Asia had profound implications for European economies and the emerging global system. The influx of Asian spices, silk, and other luxury goods transformed European markets, altering consumption patterns, social behaviors, and wealth distribution. The Manila galleon trade connected the Americas to Asia, establishing a trans-Pacific economic corridor that made silver from the New World a critical medium of exchange in Asia. This facilitated integration between East Asian and European economies, linking distant continents through goods, currency, and labor. European colonies and trading posts became vital nodes in the global flow of commodities, with the profits reinvested in naval expansion, exploration, and colonization elsewhere. The Asian trade also spurred technological and navigational advancements, as Europeans adapted to long-distance sailing, monsoon wind patterns, and the complex geography of the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. Socially and politically, these interactions encouraged European states to assert more structured control over trade routes and colonies, leading to competition and conflict among maritime powers. Ultimately, European engagement with Asia during the Age of Exploration demonstrates how commerce, navigation, and diplomacy combine to create a truly interconnected global economy, laying the groundwork for centuries of transcontinental exchange, cultural interaction, and imperial expansion. The Age of Exploration had profound effects on Africa, shaping the continent's economy, politics, and societies long before formal colonization in later centuries. Portuguese explorers were the first Europeans to establish significant contact with West and Central African coasts in the 15th century. They created fortified trading posts, such as Elmina and São Jorge de Mina, to facilitate the exchange of goods, including gold, ivory, and later enslaved Africans. Initially, trade was conducted through alliances and negotiations with local African rulers, who played an active role in supplying goods and labor to Europeans. This contact introduced European technologies, currencies, and military strategies, which altered local power dynamics and social structures. Coastal cities became centers of commerce and political influence, drawing merchants and rulers into the emerging Atlantic economy. However, these interactions were not benign. They gradually created dependency on European goods, fueled internal conflicts over control of trade, and increased the militarization of African societies. The Age of Exploration initiated a transformation in Africa's coastal regions, integrating them into global networks while simultaneously exposing them to exploitation and long-term socio-political upheaval. The most devastating impact of European exploration on Africa was the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly removed millions of Africans from their homelands to labor in the Americas. European demand for labor intensified pre-existing conflicts and created incentives for African rulers to capture and sell people from rival groups. The trade fundamentally reshaped African societies. As communities were depopulated, political structures destabilized, and social cohesion disrupted. Young and able-bodied men and women were disproportionately targeted, undermining agricultural production, economic sustainability, and demographic stability. The Middle Passage, the forced journey across the Atlantic, resulted in unimaginable suffering and mortality for enslaved Africans. Survivors were subjected to lifelong exploitation on plantations and mines in the Americas, becoming central to the global economic system. This trade not only enriched European powers but also transformed African political landscapes, as coastal states and inland kingdoms became increasingly entangled in European commercial interests. The consequences of the slave trade were both immediate and long-lasting, setting the stage for centuries of social disruption, inequality, and cultural transformation that shaped the historical trajectory of Africa. The Age of Exploration left enduring cultural, political, and economic legacies in Africa. Economically, European demand for resources and labor shifted local production priorities, encouraging export-oriented economies that prioritized goods desired by European markets. Politically, the presence of European traders and fortresses strengthened some rulers while undermining others, creating volatility, shifting alliances, and localized conflicts. Socially and culturally, the forced removal of people and exposure to European influence altered community structures, religious practices, and cultural traditions. The Atlantic slave trade created diasporic connections, linking Africa with the Americas and Europe, and giving rise to cultural exchanges that persist today in language, music, cuisine, and religious practices. At the same time, the extraction of human and material resources reinforced European dominance in global trade, contributing to wealth accumulation that fueled further exploration, conquest, and colonization elsewhere. The Age of Exploration, therefore, was not just a period of discovery and expansion. In Africa, It represented profound disruption, adaptation, and transformation, demonstrating the interconnectedness of global trade, human exploitation, and cultural change during this era. African societies were both agents and victims in the creation of the early modern global economy, shaping and being reshaped by the forces unleashed by European exploration. The Age of Exploration profoundly transformed European knowledge of the world, driving scientific and intellectual advancements that had lasting effects on geography, cartography, and navigation. As explorers charted previously unknown coasts, rivers, and islands, cartographers in Europe began producing increasingly accurate maps. The accumulation of empirical data from voyages by Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, and others enabled the refinement of latitude and longitude calculations, enhancing navigation and maritime safety. Portolan charts, originally used in the Mediterranean, were adapted for oceanic travel, while atlases began incorporating global coastlines, currents, and trade routes. The creation of these maps was a collaborative process, blending information from sailors, merchants, and indigenous informants. Furthermore, exploration spurred interest in celestial navigation and astronomy, as precise calculations of latitude depended on the observation of stars and the sun. Instruments like the astrolabe and sextant were refined, allowing sailors to undertake long-distance voyages with unprecedented accuracy. These developments marked the beginning of a more systematic, empirical approach to understanding the world, laying the foundations for modern geography and navigation. Intellectual curiosity flourished as Europeans began to comprehend the scale, diversity, and interconnectedness of the globe, challenging previous conceptions and inspiring further exploration and study. Exploration also facilitated significant cultural and intellectual exchange between Europe and the wider world. The influx of new commodities, spices, precious metals, exotic plants, and textiles stimulated not only trade but also European art, literature, and cuisine. Knowledge of foreign cultures, languages, and technologies expanded, inspiring a broader intellectual curiosity that would contribute to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Missionaries, scholars, and travelers documented indigenous knowledge of agriculture, medicine, astronomy, and engineering, which was integrated into European scholarship. Conversely, European technologies, architectural styles, and religious ideas were introduced to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, creating hybrid cultural forms in colonial settings. These interactions encouraged the questioning of traditional knowledge, the adoption of new scientific methods, and the emergence of global awareness. Universities, printing presses, and scholarly networks disseminated discoveries widely, enabling ideas to travel faster than people. The Age of Exploration, therefore, was as much a period of intellectual transformation as it was of physical discovery, fostering an unprecedented exchange of knowledge, innovation, and worldview expansion. The cultural and intellectual consequences of exploration reshaped European thought, paving the way for future scientific inquiry, economic development, and global interconnectedness. The expansion of trade networks during the Age of Exploration contributed to significant developments in economic thought and the emergence of early global systems. Merchants, financiers, and rulers gained experience in international commerce, managing complex logistics, long-distance credit, and risk through instruments such as bills of exchange and insurance. Joint stock companies such as the Dutch East India Company and English East India Company institutionalized collective investment and profit sharing, laying the foundations for modern capitalism. The vast movement of goods, labor, and capital highlighted the interdependence of continents, demonstrating how economic activity in one region could influence prices, politics, and livelihoods in another. Explorers' reports on natural resources, climates, and trade potential informed European economic strategies, while silver and gold from the Americas fueled European currency systems, and financed further exploration and military campaigns. The integration of the Americas, Africa, and Asia into a connected economic system represented one of the first instances of a truly globalized economy. This combination of empirical knowledge, trade expertise, and financial innovation illustrates how the age of exploration extended beyond navigation and conquest, shaping economic thought, global commerce, and human understanding of interconnected systems. By fostering these developments, exploration catalyzed transformations in knowledge, wealth distribution, and international relations that would resonate for centuries. The age of exploration triggered profound ecological transformations across the globe through the movement of plants, animals, and agricultural techniques between continents, a process often referred to as the Columbian Exchange. European explorers and settlers introduced crops such as wheat, barley, sugarcane, and coffee to the Americas, transforming landscapes and agricultural economies. Livestock, including cattle, pigs, horses, and sheep, were brought from Europe, altering land use, soil composition, and grazing patterns. These species often disrupted local ecosystems, competing with native flora and fauna, and sometimes leading to the decline or extinction of indigenous plants and animals. Conversely, new world crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao were transported to Europe, Africa, and Asia, revolutionizing diets, population growth, and agricultural practices. The spread of crops like potatoes and maize contributed to significant demographic shifts in Europe and Asia by providing nutrient-rich staples that supported larger populations. Agricultural techniques also traveled along with plants, as European settlers introduced plowing methods, irrigation systems, and animal husbandry practices that reshaped the environment. The Columbian Exchange, therefore, was not only a movement of goods, but also a massive ecological transformation that interconnected continents and permanently altered the natural world. European expansion during the Age of Exploration also resulted in widespread environmental degradation, particularly through mining, deforestation, and intensive agriculture. Spanish colonies in the Americas relied heavily on silver and gold mining, often using indigenous and enslaved labor under brutal conditions. Mining operations involved the clearing of forests, the diversion of water for hydraulic mining, and the introduction of toxic substances like mercury, which caused long-term environmental damage to rivers, soils, and ecosystems. Similarly, plantation economies required the clearing of vast tracts of land for sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton cultivation, resulting in deforestation, soil depletion, and the loss of biodiversity. In Africa and Asia, European demands for timber, spices, and other natural resources altered landscapes, disrupted ecosystems, and reshaped local economies. European introduced animals such as pigs and cattle further transformed land use patterns, sometimes causing overgrazing and erosion. These environmental impacts were not merely local but had cascading effects on food production, settlement patterns, and ecological stability. The Age of Exploration, therefore, represents an early example of globalization's ecological consequences, demonstrating how the pursuit of wealth, trade, and empire could fundamentally reshape natural environments across continents. The environmental and ecological changes brought about by the Age of Exploration had lasting consequences for both human societies and the natural world. The introduction of new crops, animals, and technologies reshaped diets, agricultural practices, and economic systems, supporting population growth in Europe, Africa, and Asia while transforming settlement patterns in the Americas. At the same time, environmental degradation, deforestation, soil exhaustion, pollution, and the decline of native species altered ecosystems and reduced natural resilience, creating vulnerabilities that persist today. Indigenous populations often faced compounded challenges as disease, colonization, and ecological disruption undermined traditional food systems and land management practices. Global trade and colonization also created an interconnected web of ecological dependence, where the production of a single crop or resource in one region could have far-reaching effects on distant societies and environments. These transformations highlight the dual nature of the age of exploration. It connected the world economically and culturally while imposing significant ecological costs. The environmental legacy of this period demonstrates the profound ways in which human exploration, technological innovation, and economic ambition can reshape the natural world, influencing both ecosystems and societies for centuries to come. The age of exploration fundamentally reshaped the global economic and political landscape, establishing patterns that continue to influence the modern world. The expansion of European empires into the Americas, Africa, and Asia created the first truly global trade networks, connecting continents through the exchange of goods, labor, and capital. Silver from the Americas flowed to Europe and Asia, fueling commercial expansion, banking innovations, and the rise of capitalism. Joint stock companies, such as the Dutch East India Company and English East India Company, institutionalized investment and profit sharing on a scale previously unseen, laying the foundations for modern corporate structures. Politically, the accumulation of wealth and territorial control enhanced the power of European monarchies, enabling them to project influence far beyond their borders. Maritime supremacy became a critical determinant of global influence, as control over trade routes, ports, and colonies allowed nations to extract resources, establish monopolies, and negotiate favorable treaties. The competition between Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands fostered innovation in navigation, shipbuilding, and military technology, reinforcing Europe's dominance in world affairs. These economic and political transformations created the framework for the rise of global empires and the interconnected international system that characterizes modern geopolitics. The age of exploration also catalyzed unprecedented cultural exchange and intellectual growth. The movement of peoples, ideas, and knowledge across continents facilitated encounters between European, African, Asian, and American societies, producing hybrid cultures, languages, and religious practices. European exposure to new crops, spices, technologies, and knowledge from indigenous civilizations fostered intellectual curiosity, contributing to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and later global scholarship. Missionaries, travelers, and scholars documented and disseminated information about distant lands, promoting comparative studies in geography, botany, medicine, and anthropology. At the same time, the encounter with non-European societies challenged European assumptions about human diversity, prompting philosophical debates about culture, morality, and governance. Artistic and literary expressions reflected these exchanges, incorporating motifs, techniques, and subjects from distant regions. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, local societies adapted and integrated European cultural elements while preserving indigenous traditions, creating dynamic, evolving identities. The age of exploration thus transformed not only the material world, but also the intellectual and cultural landscapes, encouraging a more interconnected and cosmopolitan understanding of humanity and the natural world. Despite its achievements, the age of exploration exacted enormous human costs, leaving a legacy of inequality, exploitation, and social disruption. The introduction of European diseases decimated indigenous populations, while conquest and colonization displaced communities, destroyed political systems, and undermined traditional ways of life. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly removed millions of Africans, subjecting them to brutal labor and creating generational trauma. Labor exploitation, resource extraction, and environmental degradation disrupted ecosystems and livelihoods worldwide. These human and ecological costs were intertwined with the economic gains of European powers, highlighting the moral and ethical dimensions of exploration. The consequences of this period continue to resonate today, influencing social hierarchies, racial dynamics, economic inequality, and cultural memory. At the same time, the resilience, adaptation, and resistance of indigenous and enslaved peoples shaped cultural, political, and social outcomes, preserving identity and knowledge despite oppression. The legacy of the Age of Exploration is therefore complex. It expanded global connectivity, fostered innovation, and reshaped economies and societies, while simultaneously imposing profound suffering and ethical challenges. Understanding this dual legacy is essential for comprehending the foundations of the modern interconnected world, the enduring impacts of European expansion, and the resilience of human societies in the face of exploration and exploitation. And that concludes our epic journey through the Age of Exploration. Today, we witnessed the incredible human spirit of curiosity and ambition that pushed explorers to the ends of the known world. We saw the rise of global trade networks, technological innovation, and cultural exchange. But we also saw the dark side of exploration. The suffering of indigenous peoples, the horrors of the slave trade, and the ecological consequences that reshaped our planet. The moral of the story is clear. Exploration can expand knowledge, innovation, and connection, but it also carries responsibility and consequences that ripple across generations. History teaches us that every achievement comes with both triumphs and costs, and understanding this balance is the key to appreciating our shared past. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to History Teller YT for more stories from the past that will inspire, educate, and transport you across time and space. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an adventure, and come back to uncover even more forgotten histories that shaped the world we live in today. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on the next journey into history.